The word hit Abigail Ralston like a slap across the face, delivered with the casual cruelty that only a woman absolutely certain of her own superiority could manage. Plain. Margaret Holloway said it right there in the middle of Cutter's Creek Mercantile, loud enough for every soul browsing bolts of fabric and tins of tobacco to hear it clearly. She didn't whisper it like a secret or murmur it like a confession. She declared it like a verdict handed down from a judge who had already decided the sentence before the trial even began. Margaret stood there in her imported yellow silk dress, her hair perfectly curled and pinned beneath a hat that had come all the way from San Francisco, and she looked Abigail up and down with eyes that had been sharpened by years of practiced disdain. "You understand what I'm telling you, don't you, Abigail? A plain woman has no business presenting herself at the Founders' Day social. The men of Cutter's Creek have standards. We all have standards. This town has a reputation to uphold, and frankly, dear, you just don't fit." The mercantile went so quiet that Abigail could hear the flies buzzing against the window pane. She could feel every set of eyes in that room turning toward her, feel the weight of their attention pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Mrs. Perkins behind the counter had stopped pretending to count her inventory. Old Hank Derringer had lowered his newspaper. Even the two ranch hands near the door had turned around, hats in their hands, expressions somewhere between uncomfortable and entertained. Abigail's face burned with a heat she refused to let become tears. She was 24 years old. She had survived her father's death, her mother's long illness, and 2 brutal winters on a claim that every man in the county had told her she couldn't hold on her own. She had survived all of that with her spine straight and her jaw set. She was not going to fall apart in front of Margaret Holloway over the word plain. But then came the voice. It came from the doorway, low and even, carrying the particular kind of quiet authority that doesn't need volume to make itself felt. It cut through the silence like a knife through river ice, and every person in that mercantile turned toward it with the automatic obedience of people who recognize real power when they hear it. I'd have to disagree with that assessment. George Barnett stood in the doorway of Cutter's Creek Mercantile with the afternoon sun behind him, which meant that, for one long, suspended moment, he was nothing but a silhouette. Tall, broad through the shoulders, with the lean, worn-in look of a man who had spent more years outdoors than in. He stepped forward into the light, and Abigail saw him clearly for the first time. Dark hair pushed back from a face that was all hard angles and weathered skin, with eyes the color of deep river water, somewhere between gray and blue depending on the light. He had a week's worth of beard growth and trail dust on his coat, and he carried himself the way men carry themselves when they have long since stopped caring what anyone thinks of their appearance. He was looking directly at Abigail. "In fact," he said, his voice still holding that same unhurried, deliberate cadence, "I'd say the assessment is wrong in just about every particular." Margaret Holloway's face cycled through surprise, offense, and the particular fury of a woman whose authority has been publicly challenged, all in the space of about 3 seconds. "I beg your pardon, and who exactly are you to George Barnett?" he said simply. "I just bought the old Callaway Ranch." "Which I believe makes me your neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, and a resident of Cutter's Creek, which I suppose means I have as much right as anyone to attend the Founders' Day social and to express my opinion on who belongs there." He finally broke his gaze from Abigail's face and looked at Margaret with an expression that was perfectly polite and completely immovable. "And my opinion is that Miss Ralston is welcome at any gathering I attend. In fact, I'd consider it an honor if she'd save me a dance." Then he looked back at Abigail, and something in his expression shifted, became quieter and more genuine, less a public statement and more a private one. He touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Ralston." And then he walked to the counter, asked Mrs. Perkins for 20 pounds of flour and a box of cartridges, paid in clean paper money, and walked back out into the afternoon sun as if none of it had happened. The mercantile erupted into whispered chaos the moment the door swung shut behind him. Abigail stood perfectly still in the middle of it all, her heart hammering against her ribs in a way that had nothing to do with humiliation and everything to do with something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She looked at the door where George Barnett had been standing, and she thought, with the clarity of a woman who has learned the hard way to recognize important moments when they arrive, that her life had just changed in some fundamental way she didn't yet understand. She did not know then how right she was. She did not know about the dark secret he was carrying, or the powerful man who wanted him destroyed, or the terrible choice that was coming for both of them. She did not know about the hidden motive behind the sale of the Callaway Ranch, or the trap that had already been set, or the sacrifice that love would eventually demand of them both. She only knew that a stranger had just stood up for her in front of the entire town, and that it was the most surprising thing that had happened to her in years. Abigail Ralston had come to Cutter's Creek, Colorado in the spring of 1878, when she was 22 years old and still raw with grief over her father's death. Thomas Ralston had been a dreamer of the specific frontier variety, a man who believed with absolute sincerity that the land would reward those who worked it faithfully enough. He had staked a claim 12 miles east of town on a stretch of creek-fed bottomland that other men had passed over, because it sat in the shadow of a ridge and got cold early in the season. Thomas had seen something in it that others hadn't, and he had been right, but the land had taken everything he had to give before it gave anything back, and Thomas Ralston had died of pneumonia in February of 1877 before the first real harvest came in. He had left Abigail the claim, the cabin, a team of horses named Josephine and General Lee, and a debt to the Cutter's Creek Territorial Bank that had felt, at the time, like a millstone around her neck. He had also left her his stubbornness, which turned out to be the most valuable thing of all. Abigail had stayed. Every man in the county, including the bank manager, a puffed-up little rooster of a man named Clarence Webb, had expected her to sell. Several of them had made offers, and one of them, a cattle rancher named Dale Holloway, who happened to be Margaret's husband, had made an offer through a lawyer's letter that had been carefully worded to sound like charity while actually being a threat. Abigail had written back in her own hand and told him no thank you. She had learned to plow behind Josephine and General Lee. She had learned to fix her own fence posts and patch her own roof and negotiate with the grain merchant in town for fair prices without letting him see how nervous she was. She had done all of it alone, because alone was what she had, and she had slowly, painfully turned her father's dream into something that actually worked. What the town had given her in return for this was not respect, exactly. It was more like a kind of grudging, baffled acknowledgement that she was still there, still standing, which the residents of Cutter's Creek seemed to find simultaneously admirable and vaguely threatening. Women like Margaret Holloway found it more than vaguely threatening. Women like Margaret had built their entire sense of themselves on the certainty that the world was ordered in a particular way, and Abigail Ralston's continued stubborn existence on that creek-fed claim was a disruption to that order that Margaret clearly found personally offensive. The plain assessment was not new. Abigail had heard variations of it her entire life. She was not beautiful in the way that Margaret Holloway was beautiful, with her perfect features and her imported clothes and her carefully maintained person. Abigail was medium height and sturdy, with brown hair that she kept in a practical braid because elaborate hairstyles were not compatible with working a farm, and gray eyes that she had been told were too light and too direct for a woman's face. She had strong hands and a manner that people frequently described as serious, which was usually not meant as a compliment. She had made peace with what she was, or she had thought she had. The walk home from the mercantile that afternoon was a strange one. Abigail drove her wagon back along the eastern road in the long golden light of late afternoon, with her supplies stacked in the bed behind her and her mind turning over and over on the events of the past hour like a stone tumbler working a rough piece of quartz. The prairie rolled out on either side of the road in shades of amber and sage, and the mountains to the west caught the last of the sun and held it like they were hoarding it. She thought about George Barnett's voice, the way it had carried without effort, the way he had looked at her, not with the calculating appraisal that men usually used when they looked at her, assessing what she owned and what she owed and whether she was a viable acquisition, but with something that had felt uncomfortably like genuine attention, like he was actually seeing her. She told herself not to make too much of it. Men said things. Men made gestures. It didn't always mean something. But the old Callaway ranch shared a fence line with her eastern pasture. She knew that much. The Callaway place had been empty for 2 years, since Franklin Callaway had drunk himself into ruin and finally sold out and disappeared. If George Barnett had truly bought it, she was going to be sharing a fence line with him. That was a fact, and it required thinking about. She turned her wagon into her own yard as the sun finally dropped behind the ridge and the air went cool and sharp. The cabin sat solid and unpretty against the darkening sky, and she felt, as she always felt when she came home to it, the particular comfort of a place that is entirely yours, that you have earned with your own hands and your own suffering, that belongs to no one in the world but you. She unharnessed the horses and fed them and went inside and made herself a supper of beans and cornbread, and she tried very hard not to think about the color of a stranger's eyes. She failed at that completely. She met him 3 days later, and it was not romantic in any way she would have chosen. She had gone out to check her eastern fence line because one of her sections had been giving her trouble, the posts going soft with rot, and she had been meaning to replace them before the cattle started testing the wire. She was 3 posts in, working with a post-hole digger in the hard morning ground, sweat already plastering her shirtwaist to her back, when she looked up and found a man on horseback watching her from the other side of the fence. George Barnett sat his horse with the ease of someone who has spent more time on horseback than off it, on a big red roan gelding that stood still and watchful as its rider. He was watching her work with an expression she couldn't immediately read, and for a moment she just looked at him, squinting into the morning sun. "I've been doing this for 20 minutes, she said. "You could have offered to help sooner." Something moved in his face, almost a smile, not quite. "I was trying to figure out if you'd want me to. I'm replacing fence posts on a shared property line. Of course I'd want help." He dismounted in one smooth motion, tied his horse to the existing wire and came through the gap in the fence. He held out a hand. "I'm George Barnett. I just took on the Callaway place. I know who you are." She handed him the post-hole digger rather than taking the offered hand, which was rude and she knew it, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her want to keep some distance. "Abigail Ralston, I know who you are too." He took the digger without comment and went to work on the next hole with the efficient application of someone who knows what they're doing. People in town are happy to talk about their neighbors. People in town are happy to talk about anything. "They speak well of you," he said, which surprised her enough that she looked at him sharply. He met her eyes briefly and then went back to digging. "Mostly. A few exceptions. Margaret Holloway," she said flatly. "I wasn't going to name names. You didn't have to." She began tamping the new post she'd set, working the dirt around its base. "What they said to you about me in town. Don't feel obligated by it. What you did in the mercantile. It's kind, but you don't need to continue it." He stopped digging and looked at her. "Is that what you think I was doing, being kind? Weren't you?" "I was being honest," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. The sun was climbing and the light was going from gold to white, and in that clear morning air he looked very solid and very real, a man who had said what he meant because he meant it and not for any other reason. She had met very few people like that in her life. "All right," she said. "Thank you for being honest then." They worked the fence line for 2 hours, moving through the rhythm of it without much talk but not uncomfortably. He knew what he was doing, she could see that. The Callaway place had been neglected for 2 years, and whoever George Barnett was, he had not bought it for the scenery. He was the kind of man who looked at a broken thing and saw what it would take to fix it and then went ahead and fixed it. When they reached the end of the damaged section, they both stood back and looked at the new post standing clean and straight in the morning light, And there was a particular satisfaction in that, the satisfaction of work done right, that Abigail recognized as one of life's uncomplicated pleasures. "I'd offer you coffee," she said, "but the cabin is a quarter-mile back." "Another time," he said. He was looking out at her land, at the way the creek ran through the bottomland and the way the pasture opened up beyond it, and she could see him taking inventory the way farmers do, cataloging assets and possibilities. "You've done good work here. My father started it. You finished it. That's its own kind of work." She looked at him again. He was 30, maybe 31, a little older than she'd thought at first in the mercantile. There were lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into sun and wind, and there was something behind those lines, something closed off and carefully contained, that she recognized as a person carrying something heavy. She knew what that looked like because she had seen it in her own mirror often enough. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "Before here," a pause, brief but definite. "Wyoming most recently, before that Kansas." "Most recently," she repeated. "That's an interesting way to put it." "I move around." He picked up his jacket from where he'd laid it on the wire. "Or I did. I'm done moving." She wanted to ask him more about that. She wanted to ask him why Wyoming and Kansas, what he'd done there, who he'd left behind, what the dark thing was that she could see sitting behind his river water eyes. She didn't ask any of those things because she had been raised by a man who believed that people had the right to their own secrets until they chose to share them. "Well," she said, "welcome to Cutter's Creek, Mr. Barnett." "George," he said. "George," she agreed. And she picked up her tools and walked back toward her cabin, and she did not look back, though she could feel his gaze on her back for a long time after she turned away. The Founders' Day social came around on a Friday in the middle of June, as it always did. It was held on the grounds of the Territorial Hotel, which was Cutter's Creek's one genuine claim to elegance, a two-story building with a proper veranda that wrapped around 3 sides, and a ballroom that could hold 200 people if they didn't mind being friendly about it. Tables were set up on the lawn and paper lanterns strung between the cottonwood trees, and the town's hired musicians played from a platform near the hotel's back door. Abigail almost didn't go. She stood in her cabin on the afternoon of the social and looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, and had the honest, unsentimental conversation with herself that she was periodically required to have. She was not beautiful. She had never been beautiful. The years of farm work had made her stronger but had not done anything particular for her softness, and she had no silk dress, only the good dark blue wool she wore to church, which was serviceable and clean but absolutely nothing more than that. Her hair, when she let it down from its braid, was thick and dark and fell to her shoulder blades, and she supposed that was something. Her eyes in the right light were quite fine. She thought about Margaret Holloway's face when George Barnett had spoken up. She pinned her hair up carefully, put on the blue wool dress, and went. The social was already in full swing when she arrived, the music carrying across the evening air and the lanterns lighting up warm and golden in the early dark. She tied her horse at the rail and walked onto the lawn with her chin level and her expression composed, and she felt the usual thing, that slight but unmistakable shift in the social atmosphere that always happened when Abigail Ralston arrived somewhere, the small recalibration of who was looking at whom and what was being said about it. She got herself a glass of punch and stood near the edge of the lawn and watched the dancing for a while and talked to the handful of people who came to talk to her, mostly the other farming women of similar circumstances, women who had come west with husbands and stayed when circumstances changed, women who understood the particular math of surviving alone. She did not see George Barnett, and she told herself she hadn't been looking. Then the music changed to something slower, and she looked up from her conversation with Harriet Doyle, who farmed a claim north of town and had 4 children and the forearms of a longshoreman, and there he was. He had cleaned up. That was the first thing she registered, with a kind of absurd irrelevance. He had shaved the trail beard and his dark hair was combed back, and he was wearing a coat that, while not elegant, was clearly his best and had been brushed carefully. He was talking to the sheriff, a weathered man named Abner Cole, and nodding at whatever Cole was saying. But even as she registered all of this from 40 feet away, he turned his head as if he had known exactly where she was standing and found her eyes across the crowd. He said something to Sheriff Cole, touched his arm briefly in a way that was clearly a polite excuse, and came toward her. "You came," he said when he reached her. "You said it would be an honor if I came," she said. "I decided to take you at your word." "Good." He looked at her for a moment with that same quality of attention she had noticed before, that sense of actually seeing her, and she made herself hold still under it instead of looking away. "You look very fine, Miss Ralston." "Abigail," she said, "and thank you. Will you dance with me?" She looked at the floor where couples were moving in a slow pattern to something the fiddle player was drawing out with real feeling. "I'm not much of a dancer. Farm work and dancing use different muscles." "Neither am I," he said. "We can be bad at it together." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh. It came out before she could stop it, real and genuine, and she saw something in his face soften slightly at the sound of it, something that had been held carefully in check give just a fraction. "All right," she said. "Together, then." He was, in fact, a better dancer than he had claimed, which she suspected immediately and confirmed within about 30 seconds of moving onto the floor. He led with a quiet sureness that made it easy to follow, his hand at her waist firm and correct, and she felt the unfamiliar but not unpleasant sensation of someone taking care of something for her, of being, for a few minutes, in someone else's capable hands. "You've danced before," she said. "Some." "More than some, a beat. My mother was from Virginia. She believed dancing was a moral obligation." Abigail smiled. "Smart woman." "Extraordinary woman," he said, and the shift in his tone when he said it, that particular softness and past tense, told her everything she needed to know about when his mother had died and how much he had loved her. They danced twice and then stood together at the edge of the lawn with fresh glasses of punch, and they talked. That was the thing she would remember most clearly afterward, that they talked. Not the small, safe, circling talk of new acquaintances who are feeling each other out with careful questions, but real talk, the kind that happens when two people recognize something in each other and decide to stop pretending it isn't there. He asked her about the farm, and she told him about it honestly, about what had gone wrong in the first year and what had gotten better and what she was still fighting. He listened without offering unsolicited solutions, which was rarer in a man than it should have been. She asked him about the Calloway place, and he described what he'd found there. 2 years of neglect and the particular kind of damage that comes from a property left without care, and what he planned to do about it. And she could see in the way he described it that this was not just a business calculation, but something more personal, something that mattered to him in a way that he was being careful not to say too directly. Margaret Holloway materialized at some point during the evening, and Abigail watched her notice them standing together from across the lawn, and watched the calculation move across her perfect features before she turned away and became very interested in something happening in the opposite direction. That was its own small victory, quiet and private, and Abigail tucked it away. Near the end of the evening, when the music had gone slow and many of the families with children had already loaded their wagons and headed home, George turned to her and said, out of nowhere, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you can say no and I will not take it wrongly." She looked at him. "All right. Would you be willing to have dinner with me at a proper establishment, not because I'm obligated to after what I said in the mercantile, because I genuinely like to know you better?" Abigail looked at him for a long moment. She was 24 years old and she had been alone for 2 years, and she had made a working life for herself out of stubborn refusal to quit, and she had told herself many times that she was fine on her own, that she didn't need anything or anyone she didn't already have. All of that was true. She had also spent the last 3 hours talking to someone and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like herself in a way that she hadn't even realized she'd been missing. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." The danger arrived before the dinner did, as it has a way of doing when someone has a dark past they haven't fully outrun. She found out the shape of it from the most unlikely source, which was Harriet Doyle, who turned out to know more about the general business of the territory than anyone had the right to know for someone who spent most of her time 12 miles north of town. Harriet came by Abigail's farm on a Tuesday morning with a basket of her famous sourdough bread and the kind of expression that means someone has news they are not sure how to deliver. Abigail put on coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table and Harriet talked. George Barnett, it turned out, had not come to Cutter's Creek from nothing. He had come from a specific and complicated something. He had, in fact, been a deputy marshal in Cheyenne, Wyoming, under a man named Ellis Vane, who had been the territorial marshal for 6 years, and who had, over those 6 years, built himself a criminal empire on the side while wearing his badge with great public dignity. George had uncovered it. He had gathered evidence carefully over 2 years, evidence of bribery and protection rackets, and at least 2 murders that had been officially ruled accidents, and he had sent that evidence to the federal authorities in Denver. Ellis Vane had been arrested 18 months ago. He was currently awaiting trial in Denver. He had also, from his cell, using intermediaries who were very good at their jobs, put out word that George Barnett was a man he held personally responsible for his current situation, and that George Barnett's continued existence in good health was something he found troubling. 3 men had already tried to collect on that informal bounty. 2 of them were in federal custody in Wyoming. The third had simply disappeared. George had left Wyoming and gone to Kansas, and then, when the shadow had followed him there too, had bought the Callaway Ranch under a name that was only slightly removed from his own, which had turned out not to be enough distance because Ellis Vane's people were thorough. "How do you know all of this?" Abigail asked Harriet. Harriet wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Because Sheriff Cole told my husband. And my husband told me because he thought I should know, given that I live 12 miles from a man who has a price on his head." Abigail stared at the table for a long moment. She thought about the quality of contained watchfulness she had noticed in George Barnett from the very beginning. She thought about the way he had said most recently when she'd asked where he was from. She thought about the closed-off thing behind his eyes and understood now what it was. Not mere sadness, not simple loneliness, but the particular vigilance of a man who has learned that the danger to his life is real and constant. "He's a brave man," she said finally. Harriet looked at her carefully. "He's a marked man, Abigail. Those things are not mutually exclusive. Abigail." "I know," she said. She looked up at Harriet. "I'm not an idiot, Harriet. I know what you're telling me. I'm telling you to be careful." "I will be careful," she said. "I'm always careful. It's how I'm still here." She went to their planned dinner anyway. She wore the blue wool dress again because it was all she had that was adequate for the occasion, and she met him at the Territorial Hotel dining room on a Thursday evening. He was already there when she arrived, standing when she came in the way men from good families do without thinking about it, and something about the gesture, so automatic and so genuine, made her throat tight in a way she didn't entirely understand. They ate roast beef and talked about books. She had not expected that. She had expected cattle prices and weather and land, the safe subjects, the subjects that didn't ask anything of either of them. Instead, he had asked her, apropos of apparently nothing, whether she read, and she had said yes, and they had ended up in an argument about Sir Walter Scott that lasted through the entire meal and was the best conversation she had had in years. She told him she knew. She had decided to tell him before she arrived, and she didn't let herself hesitate or soften it. She waited until the meal was finished and the plates had been cleared and they were sitting with coffee, and she said, "I know about Cheyenne, about Vane, about why you came here." His face did a complicated thing. She watched the surprise and the calculation and then a kind of resignation move through it, and then something harder and more honest underneath all of those. "Harriet Doyle," he said. "Harriet Doyle," she confirmed. A silence. So, she agreed. "I'm not afraid of it. I want you to know that. I'm also not naive about it. I wanted you to know that too." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Most people, when they find out, they recalculate. "I'm not most people." "No," he said. "I'm becoming very aware of that." He turned his coffee cup in its saucer, slow and deliberate. "I should have told you myself. I was going to. I just hadn't found the right way yet." The right way would have been directly. That's always the right way. You're very straightforward. I've been told it's not an appealing quality in a woman. By whom? Various people whose opinion I've stopped valuing. He smiled. It was a real smile, not the almost smile she'd seen before, and it changed his face considerably, opened it up and made him look younger and less burdened, and she felt something move in her chest that she recognized, with a clarity that was almost alarming, as falling. Not fallen, falling. The process ongoing, not yet complete. "I'm going to testify at the trial," he said. "In Denver. It's in September. After that, Vane goes to prison and the bounty becomes meaningless." "What about between now and September?" "I watch my back. That's not a plan. It's what I have." He looked at her. "I'm not going to drag you into this." "You don't get to decide what I'm dragged into," she said. "I decide that for myself." Another long look. "Abigail, George," she held his gaze. "I make my own choices about my own risks. I always have. So I need you to stop deciding things for me and start having actual, honest conversations with me. Can you do that?" A pause. Then, "I think I can. I think I'd like to try." "Good," she said. "Then let's start with the question of whether you'd like to come for Sunday dinner. I make a decent pot roast." He came for Sunday dinner, and then the following Sunday, and the one after that. July arrived and the heat settled into the valley, and the days grew long, and the grass in Abigail's pasture stood knee-high and golden. And George Barnett rode over the fence line between their two properties on Sunday mornings with a frequency that stopped being remarkable sometime around the third week and started being simply, quietly expected. She watched him work. She couldn't help it. He was rebuilding the Callaway place from the ground up, essentially fixing years of neglect with methodical, unhurried competence. And sometimes when she was working her own fence line or checking on her cattle in the eastern pasture, she could see him on his land, a distant figure moving with purpose, and she found the sight of it consistently reassuring in a way that was becoming harder to pretend was just about neighborly relations. He helped her when she needed it and didn't offer when she didn't, and this balance was so precisely right that she sometimes thought he must have practiced it. But when she looked at him, she knew it wasn't practiced. It was just how he was. He had learned somehow the difference between help and help that was actually the removal of someone's agency over their own life. One evening in late July, he stayed past dark. They had been sitting on her porch after dinner, talking, as they had started doing with some regularity, and the talk had wound down into a comfortable silence, which was its own particular milestone. And then she'd realized the stars were out, and the evening had gone cool, and the fire in the stove had burned low. He'd stood to go and then stopped and turned back and looked at her for a moment with that expression that she had come to know, the one that meant he wanted to say something he hadn't quite worked out how to say. "You asked me once to be honest with you," he said. "I did. So I'm going to be honest." He stood there in the doorway, the dark behind him and the warm lamplight of her kitchen on his face, and he said, "I'm in a situation that is not fully resolved. I have something coming at me that I can't guarantee is going to end the way I need it to. And I am aware that none of that is a recommended foundation for." He stopped. "I'm making a poor job of this." "You're doing all right," she said. "Keep going." "I would like," he said slowly and carefully, "to court you properly, if you're willing, understanding all the circumstances." Abigail looked at him. She thought about the farm and the 2 years of alone and the carefully maintained competence that was also, if she was honest, a carefully maintained loneliness. She thought about what it had felt like to hear his voice in the mercantile, saying that he disagreed. She thought about Sunday dinners and fence posts, and the argument about Sir Walter Scott and the way his face looked when he laughed, which was becoming one of her favorite things in the world. "I'm willing," she said. He let out a breath that she realized he had been holding for quite some time. The threat materialized in the first week of August, on a hot Wednesday afternoon when Abigail was in her barn working on Josephine's bridle, which had developed a problem with the bit fitting. She heard hoofbeats on the road, fast and purposeful, and looked up to see two riders pulling into her yard. They were not the kind of men who rode through looking for water or directions. She knew that before they even stopped their horses. There was something in the way they sat their mounts, too casual, too watchful at the same time, that she recognized as the posture of men who had come to do something specific. One of them was thin with a narrow face and a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. The other was broader, heavier, with a dull, patient look. "Ma'am," the narrow one said, touching his hat with a mockery of courtesy, "we're looking for a man named Barnett, George Barnett. We understand he lives adjacent to your property." "I don't know anyone by that name," Abigail said. Her voice came out level. She was very proud of that. "That's funny. Because 4 people in town told us he'd been spending considerable time here. People in town tell all kinds of stories." The narrow man's pleasant expression did not change, but his eyes got colder. "Ma'am, I'd encourage you to be careful about being unhelpful. This is a business matter and it doesn't need to involve you, but it could involve you if it came to that." Abigail looked at him. She set down the bridle slowly and deliberately, and she said, "Are you threatening me on my own property? I'm offering you a chance to stay clear of something that isn't your business." "Everything on this land is my business," she said. "My land, my business. I'd like you to ride off it now, please." The heavier man made a sound that might have been a laugh. The narrow man looked at her for another few seconds, calculating, and then he turned his horse. "We'll find him," he said. "Tell him that, if you happen to see him." They rode off. Abigail stood very still until they were gone, and then she went into her cabin, loaded her father's Henry repeating rifle, and sat down at the table for about 10 minutes while the shaking in her hands ran its course. Then she went back outside, saddled Josephine, and rode hard to the Callaway Ranch. George came out of his barn before she was even off the horse, reading her face before she said a word, and she saw his expression go flat and still in the way it did when he was managing something that frightened him. She told him about the 2 men. He listened without interrupting. "I need to get word to Sheriff Cole," he said immediately. "I already stopped on the way. Cole wasn't in town, but his deputy took my statement." He looked at her for a moment. "You stopped at the sheriff's office before you came here." Of course, that was the correct sequence. Something in his face, some last careful reserve, seemed to give way. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and put both his hands on her shoulders, and looked at her with an expression that was beyond what she had seen from him before, beyond the controlled watchfulness and the careful politeness. This was unguarded, and a little desperate and completely sincere. "You are the most capable person I have ever met," he said, "and I need you to understand that I am not going to let anything happen to you because of my problems." "Your problems are not going to touch me if we handle them correctly," she said. "Now can we sit down and think about this rationally?" Sheriff Cole found the 2 men the following morning, camped on the East Road outside town. They were, as it turned out, professional bounty hunters, which meant that while what they were doing was morally in service of Ellis Vane's desire for revenge, they were technically operating within the law in terms of their presence in the territory. Cole talked to them with the particular firmness of a man who has been doing his job for a long time and knows exactly how much authority he has and how to use it, and they moved on. But both Cole and George knew they would be back, or someone else would come. "September," George said, sitting at Abigail's kitchen table that evening with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "The trial is in September. If I get to Denver to testify, Vane goes away. The bounty ends. How do you get to Denver safely?" She asked. "Cole can arrange a federal escort. He's already wired Denver." "That's good." She sat across from him and looked at his hands on the table, the knuckles slightly scarred, the hands of a man who has spent his life in physical work. She thought about what it would take to do what he had done, to spend 2 years quietly gathering evidence against a powerful man while working beside him every day, to send that evidence and wait for the consequences and then live with them. "George," he looked up. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I'm not frightened. Not of this situation. I've been managing frightening situations on my own for 2 years and I'm competent at it. What I am," she stopped and found the word she had been looking for since June. "What I am is invested in how this resolves. In you, that's what I want you to understand." He looked at her for a long time, then he said, "I think I knew that. Good, so stop trying to manage me away from it." "I'm not trying to manage you away from anything." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I'm trying to not be the reason you get hurt." "I know." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was a more forward thing than she had done before, and felt him go still under the touch. "I know you are, and it's important to me that you know I'm not standing here because I'm uninformed or because I don't understand the risk. I'm standing here because I choose to." He turned his hand over under hers and closed his fingers around it, and they sat like that for a while in her kitchen, with the lamp burning between them and the night outside the windows, and the weight of the coming weeks like something they were both holding up together. August was the hardest month. The tension of waiting is its own particular kind of suffering, different from active crisis, because it has no specific event to aim at, only the ambient pressure of knowledge that something is coming, and the inability to know exactly when or from which direction. George and Abigail moved through the days with careful normality, working their respective properties, visiting in the evenings, building the slow architecture of two people learning each other's rhythms and preferences and particular silences, while underneath all of it ran the constant low current of awareness that the situation was not resolved. There was another incident in the second week of August. A man Abigail didn't know appeared at the Callaway Ranch while she was there helping George mend a section of roof, and he was carrying a message, which was how Ellis Vane apparently preferred to operate when the direct approach was too obvious. The message was the ordinary kind that bounty arrangements generate, an invitation to reconsider one's choices, a suggestion that the correct choice would be rewarded. George read it and burned it in the fire without answering, which was its own kind of answer. Cole sent 3 wires to Denver in that fortnight, and received back from the federal marshal's office a guarantee of escort. 2 deputy marshals who would arrive in Cutter's Creek in the last week of August to take George to Denver safely for the trial date in the first week of September. The evening before George was due to leave, Abigail invited him for dinner, and she cooked everything she had been told she made well, which turned out to be a substantial meal. She set the table carefully, with the good cloth she usually saved for Christmas, and she put wildflowers in a jar in the center because it was still summer and there were wildflowers available. And when he arrived and looked at the table, she saw him register all of it with an expression that made her breath catch. After dinner, they sat on her porch again in the warm August dark, and the conversation was quieter than usual, weighted with what was coming. "The ranch will be fine," she said. "I'll keep an eye on it while you're gone." "I know you will." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about something. Tell me. When this is over, when the trial is done and the situation with Vane is resolved." He stopped, started again. "I've been thinking about what I want. For the first time in a long time, I've been thinking about what comes next in a way that isn't just about surviving to the next week." She waited. She had learned to wait for him to find his words, because he was not a man who said things before he was ready to say them properly. "I want to stay here," he said. "I want to make the Callaway place into something real. I want to be a part of this community for good, and I want—" He turned and looked at her in the porch dark. "I want you in my life, not just as a neighbor, not just as a friend. I want to court you properly, and then I want to ask you to marry me when the time is right, if that's something you could want." Abigail sat very still. The night around them was full of cricket song and the distant sound of the creek running over its stones, and the stars were out in a quantity that you only see that far from city lights, a whole blaze of them overhead. She thought about being 24 and alone, and what it had cost her to make her life what it was. She thought about what it might cost her to let someone into it. She thought about George Barnett's voice in the mercantile, saying I would have to disagree with that assessment, and the extraordinary, unexpected relief of being seen. "Ask me when the time is right," she said, "and I'll tell you yes." She heard his breath. He reached out in the dark and found her hand, and they sat like that on her porch until quite late, not saying much of anything, just being present together under the stars, and it was one of the best evenings Abigail Ralston had ever spent. He left the next morning with the two deputy marshals, both capable-looking men who took their job with appropriate seriousness. Abigail stood in her yard and watched him go, and she held herself together with the same composed steadiness that had gotten her through her father's death and her mother's illness and 2 terrible winters, and she told herself that he was going to be fine, that the system of law that he had served and sacrificed for was going to protect him now. September was the longest month of her life. She threw herself into work with the particular ferocity of someone who is using physical labor to manage emotional anxiety. She worked her farm with an intensity that she would later recognize as the outlet it was, mending every fence that needed mending, cleaning out the barn, getting her crops in with a thoroughness that left nothing to chance. She checked on the Callaway Ranch every 3 days as she had promised, walking the fence lines and making sure nothing was deteriorating in his absence. She received letters. 2, over the course of the weeks he was gone, written in his handwriting, which was cleaner and more careful than she had expected, the handwriting of a man who had been educated past what his occupation suggested. The letters told her he had arrived safely, that the trial was proceeding, that Denver was a large and bewildering city full of people in a hurry, which he found exhausting, that he thought about Cutter's Creek with a longing that surprised him. She wrote back. She told him about the farm and the ranch and the weather and Harriet Doyle's latest news, which was that Harriet was expecting her 5th child in the spring and was characteristically unemotional about it. She told him that the wildflowers were fading with the season, and that the aspen in the hills had started to turn, and that she had made a pot roast last Sunday, and it had been unacceptably quiet eating it alone. On the 14th of September, Sheriff Cole came to her farm in the afternoon with his hat in his hands and an expression she couldn't read. Her heart stopped. Then he said, "The verdict came through this morning. Ellis Vane, guilty on all counts. Federal prison in Cannon City for 25 years. He paused. "George Barnett is coming home." Abigail sat down on her porch steps because her legs declined to hold her anymore, and Cole had the decency to pretend he didn't notice that her eyes had gone bright with moisture. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment, getting herself under control, and then she said, "When?" 3 days, likely, maybe 4, she nodded. "Thank you, Sheriff." Cole put his hat back on. "He's a good man, Miss Ralston. Thought you'd want to hear it from a person who said it plainly." He said that last word with a very deliberate quality, and she looked up at him and saw the faint smile, and she surprised them both by laughing. "I would," she said. "Thank you." He came home on a Thursday afternoon, and she was in her yard when he rode up the track, and she walked to the fence, and he stopped his horse and looked at her across it, and he looked tired in a specific way, the tiredness of sustained tension that has finally released, and he was trail dusty and unshaven again, and she had never in her life been so glad to see a person. "It's done," he said. "I know. Cole told me." He swung down from his horse and came through the gate, and she went to meet him, and it was completely natural and not awkward in the least, the way he put his arms around her and held on, and the way she held on back, both of them just standing in her yard in the autumn afternoon being solid and real and present for each other. After a while he stepped back and looked at her, and his hands were still on her arms, and he said, "I have something I need to ask you." "I told you I'd say yes," she said. He blinked. Then he laughed, startled and genuine, and she felt that laugh like warmth in her chest. You might give a man the chance to do it properly. Then do it properly. He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a ring. She had not expected a ring. It was simple, a gold band with a small garnet set in it, dark red and clear, and it had the look of something that had belonged to someone before, something held onto carefully across a great deal of distance. "This was my mother's," he said. "She'd have approved of you, that I'm certain of." He looked at her with the full, unguarded expression that she had first seen at her kitchen table and had been chasing ever since. "Abigail Ralston, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I already told you I would." "You were remarkably confident about that." "I'm confident about most things." She held out her hand and he put the ring on her finger and it fit well enough, and she looked at it for a moment, that small red stone in the autumn light. "It's beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you," he said, and she looked up at him quickly, because that was a different kind of statement than what he usually made, more open, less guarded, and he met her eyes without looking away, and she understood that he had meant it entirely. She kissed him then, which was forward of her, and she didn't care at all, standing in her own yard on her own land that she had built from grief and stubbornness and her father's dream, and she felt, in that moment, something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular and profound lightness of a future that had just opened up. The wedding was in November. They planned it for a Saturday, and they kept it simple because both of them wanted simple. But simple in Cutter's Creek turned out to mean that half the town showed up anyway, because the combination of a man who had taken down a corrupt marshal and a woman who had held her farm alone for 2 years was the kind of story that people want to be present for. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony in the church, which smelled of pine resin and cold and the particular dusty warmth of candles. Abigail wore a dress she hadn't owned before, and it was the one concession she had allowed herself to the occasion, a deep green wool that Harriet Doyle had helped her select from the fabric bolts at the mercantile, in the same spot where Margaret Holloway had once said the word plain like a verdict. There was something satisfying about that circularity that she didn't try to analyze too deeply. George stood at the front of the church in a good dark coat and looked at her when she walked in with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his own luck, and she thought, as she walked toward him, that she had never in her life felt less plain. They said their vows quietly and clearly, looking at each other, and Reverend Marsh said the words over them, and they were married. Harriet Doyle cried, which surprised everyone including Harriet. Sheriff Cole sat in the back pew with his arms folded and a satisfied expression like a man watching something work out the way it should. Even Mrs. Perkins from the mercantile was there, tucked into a middle pew with her good hat on, nodding along. Margaret Holloway was not there. Abigail had not expected her to be, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not care at all. What happened in that mercantile in June had been the last time Margaret Holloway's opinion had touched her, and it had only touched her for as long as it had taken George Barnett to speak up. After the ceremony there was a gathering at the Territorial Hotel, the same place they had danced at the Founders' Day social, and this time there was considerably more dancing and considerably less restraint about it. And Abigail danced with George and with Sheriff Cole, and with Harriet's husband Daniel, and even briefly with old Hank Derringer, who had been watching from behind his newspaper in the mercantile, and had apparently been rooting for them ever since. Late in the evening, when things had wound down and the musicians had packed their instruments and only a few friends remained in the warm room, George found her at the edge of it and put his arm around her shoulders and said, very quietly, "Are you happy?" She leaned into him. "I am." "Good," he said. "Me too." The winter was the best one Abigail had ever spent. They worked their properties together, which in practice meant that the fence line between them became more of an administrative detail than an actual division. George's cattle mixed with her cattle in the bottomland pasture, and her kitchen fed 2 instead of 1, and the Sunday dinners that had started as a careful social experiment became simply the way they lived. He moved into her cabin because it was in better repair than the Calloway house, and they spent evenings by the fire talking and reading, and sometimes not talking at all. And the silence between them had the particular quality of real companionship, comfortable and sustaining. He was a good husband in the specific ways that matter more than the general declaration. He did not tell her what to do with her land. He did not try to take over her farm or subsume it into his or suggest that she step back from the management of it. He was her partner in the fullest sense, bringing what he had and she bringing what she had, and between the two of them they had considerably more than either had separately. He was also funny, which she had suspected and now had confirmed, funny in a dry, quiet way that caught her off guard sometimes and made her laugh out loud in a way that startled both of them and then pleased them. He could also be unexpectedly tender in small ways, remembering things she had mentioned once, noticing when she was tired before she admitted it, making coffee in the morning the way she liked it without being asked after the first week. In February, she told him she was expecting. He went completely still for about 5 seconds, and then his face did the thing she had first seen when she walked into the church, that helpless, astonished expression, and he crossed the kitchen and pulled her into a hug that lifted her slightly off the floor, which she had not expected from a man of his characteristic restraint. "Put me down," she said. "I'm not fragile. I know you're not fragile." He set her down but kept his hands on her waist, looking at her. "A baby. That is what expecting means, yes. Abigail." "George," she said, matching his tone, smiling. He kissed her, and it was warm and deliberate, and had in it everything that they had built over the months since June, the mercantile and the fence posts and the dancing and the letters and the verdict and the ring and the vows, all of it compressed into that one moment on a cold February morning in their kitchen. Spring came and the ground thawed and they planted together, working side by side in the long days, and Abigail worked as long and as hard as she always had, which George had learned not to argue with, because she was healthy and competent, and argument on this point invariably led to a look from her that he had privately categorized as the look that means the discussion is concluded. They hired a hand for the summer, a young man named Pete Ortega from a family in the valley who knew cattle and didn't know fences and was willing to learn the second, and he became part of the daily rhythm of the two properties as they gradually merged into something that felt like a single enterprise. The Calloway house, meanwhile, was being made into a real thing under George's methodical attention. He replaced the roof and the floor in the main room and rebuilt the chimney that had been crumbling for 2 years, and he and Pete whitewashed the walls inside and out, and Harriet Doyle declared it transformed when she came to visit in May, which was the highest available compliment given Harriet's general standards. Abigail thought it might make a good bunkhouse eventually, or a place for Pete to live when he was established enough to need a place of his own. Or there were other possibilities she was beginning to turn over in her mind, longer-term possibilities, the kind that go with expanding what a family looks like over time. In July, which was warm and golden and smelled of cut grass, and the particular richness of well-watered bottomland in high summer, George came to find her one evening when she was sitting on the porch watching the light go out of the sky over the ridge. He sat down beside her and was quiet for a while, and she waited for whatever it was. "I got a letter today," he said, "from a man I worked with in Wyoming. The federal marshal's office is looking for experienced men. There's a position." He paused. "I'm not going to take it." She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because my life is here. It would be honest work, important work." "I've done that work," he said. "I did it for 6 years, and I'm proud of what I accomplished with it, and I almost died for it twice, and then I came here and found something I didn't know I was looking for." He looked at her. "I'm not going back. I'm done moving." She remembered him saying that, standing at the fence line on a sharp morning in May with the post-hole digger in his hands. "I'm done moving." She had heard it then, and she heard it now, and the word that sat underneath it in both cases was home. "All right," she said. "Just all right." "Did you want me to argue with you about it? I thought you might want to weigh in." I did want to weigh in, she said. My weighing in was, all right. She leaned her shoulder against his. You're where you want to be. I'm where I want to be. And in about 3 months we're going to have a baby who gets to grow up on this land and know it as home from the beginning, which is better than most people get. That's enough for me, George. That's more than enough. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And they sat on the porch in the summer evening, the way they had been sitting on that porch for a year now, comfortable and solid and real. Dale Holloway's cattle got into her eastern pasture in August, which would have been a different kind of incident a year ago, but was, now, simply an occasion for a frank conversation with Dale that George attended at her side and said very little during, because Abigail handled it entirely by herself with a competence that left Dale looking somewhat chastened and his cattle promptly removed. George, walking back from the pasture afterward, told her that was one of the most impressive things he'd ever seen. He's been testing that fence line for 2 years, she said. I've been waiting for the chance to address it directly. You were very direct. It was required. She glanced at him. You could have helped. You didn't need it. No, she agreed, but sometimes not needing it and wanting it aren't the same thing. He stopped walking and looked at her. Next time I'll say something. Thank you, she resumed walking. Also, I think we should buy his north section when it comes up for sale. He's overextended and it's going to come up by spring. George was quiet for a moment. Then, that's very forward thinking. It's good bottomland and it connects to the upper pasture. With Pete's help and possibly another hand by then, we could run 3 times the cattle we're running now. All right, he said, and she recognized her own word back to her and smiled. Just all right. I learned from the best, he said. Their son was born on a clear October morning when the aspen had fully turned and the valley glowed amber and gold, delivered by the local doctor, a steady man named Warren Briggs who had been delivering babies in the territory for 15 years and had a calm, authoritative manner that Abigail appreciated greatly on the morning in question. George was present throughout, which was not customary but which he had made clear to Dr. Briggs was not negotiable, and which turned out to mean he spent a significant portion of the morning in the grip of a fear that he was entirely unable to manage with his usual control, because it was Abigail, and controlling what happened to Abigail was beyond the scope of his considerable competence. When it was done and Dr. Briggs put the baby in his arms, he stood there looking down at a person so small and so completely new that he was, for the first time in Abigail's experience, entirely without words. She watched him from the bed, tired in a way she had not known tiredness could feel, but essentially fine, which Dr. Briggs had confirmed. She watched the expression on George's face while he held their son, and it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, completely open, all the watchfulness and the careful containment gone, nothing left but wonder. What do you want to name him? She asked. He looked up at her. Whatever you choose. I choose Thomas, she said, after my father. He was quiet for a moment. Thomas Barnett, he said, trying the shape of it. Thomas. The baby had his eyes open, unfocused and blinking, and George looked down at him with an expression that had settled into something she recognized, quietly and with a full heart, as love. Thomas it is. Harriet Doyle arrived the following afternoon with bread and soup, and the specific efficiency of a woman who has done this 5 times herself. She held Thomas Barnett for approximately 4 minutes before declaring him perfect, which from Harriet was a significant rating, and set him back in his basket and made Abigail eat soup before she was allowed to talk. You look good, Harriet said, studying her with the frank assessment of genuine friendship. Tired but good. I feel good, Abigail said. Tired but good. George came in from outside where he had been helping Pete with the morning work, and Harriet looked at him and then at Abigail and said with a completeness of satisfaction, well, everything worked out, didn't it? It was not quite a question. Yes, Abigail said, it did. The years that followed were full years. The Holloway North section came up for sale in March, as Abigail had predicted, and they bought it at a fair price, and Pete Ortega moved into the Calloway house with some adjustments for his comfort, and a raise that reflected his expanded responsibilities. A second hand was hired the following spring, a quiet young man named Jonas Weber who had come up from New Mexico and knew horses in a way that was immediately useful. Thomas Barnett grew. He was his father's height by the time he was walking, which made George laugh in a way that was entirely unprepared and genuine, and he had his mother's gray eyes and her direct, serious way of looking at the world that already suggested he would be a person who said what he meant and meant what he said. He also had, emerging around the age of 3, a cheerfulness that neither of them could fully account for, a fundamental good humor about the business of being alive that was entirely his own. Abigail told George she was expecting again on an evening in the second year, with Thomas already asleep in his crib and the fire burning low, and he did not lift her off the floor this time, but he held her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and then her mouth and said, "Again." "Again," she confirmed. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not terrified," he said. "I know you're terrified," she said. "You're allowed to be. You were terrified last time too. You knew that." "Of course I knew that." "You were absolutely transparent." "I'm never transparent." "You are with me," she said. "Always. It's one of the things I love most about you." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had been seeing since a certain afternoon in a mercantile in June 2 years ago, the one that said he saw her completely and what he saw was something worth seeing. "I love you," he said. "Every day I find more reasons to." "Every day I find more reasons to love you," she said, "which I did not think was possible, and yet here we are." Their daughter was born in the autumn of the following year, delivered again by Dr. Briggs on a morning when the first snow of the season was coming down light and quiet outside the cabin windows. They named her Clara for George's mother, the extraordinary woman from Virginia who had believed dancing was a moral obligation and who had, it turned out, raised a son worth knowing. Thomas, aged 2, was introduced to his sister with a gravity that suggested he understood the magnitude of the occasion, and then attempted to hand her a wooden horse he had been carrying since breakfast, which the doctor gently redirected. Their life was not without its difficulties, because life in the territory in 1880 was not without difficulties for anyone. There were hard winters and a drought in the summer of the third year that required careful management and some sacrifice, and a renegotiation of their debt to the bank that took several weeks of anxious calculation before it resolved satisfactorily. There were disputes with other landowners, and cattle that strayed and machinery that broke at the worst possible moments, and the 1,000 ordinary crises of a working life on the frontier. There was one bad winter when Thomas got sick with a fever that lasted a week, during which George and Abigail took turns sitting with him through the nights, and neither of them slept enough, and both of them lived in a fear they couldn't say out loud to each other. The fever broke on the 8th day, and Thomas looked up at his mother with his gray eyes clear and said, "I'm hungry." And Abigail went into the kitchen and let herself cry for about 3 minutes and then came back with soup, and her face composed. George found her later in the barn, tending to the horses with the excessive thoroughness of someone using physical activity to process relief, and he just stood at the barn door and said, "He's going to be fine," and she said, "I know," and he said, "He's as stubborn as his mother," and she said, "Good." And they looked at each other and both understood that neither of them was quite fine yet, but that they would be, and that they had each other, which made the not fine yet survivable. Margaret Holloway left Cutter's Creek in the spring of 1881, when Dale Holloway's financial overextension finally caught up with him, and he was forced to sell the Maine ranch property and relocate to his brother's place in New Mexico. Abigail heard about it from Harriet Doyle, who reported it with the particular neutrality of a woman who has strong opinions but recognizes that expressing them in certain directions is unproductive. Abigail's own neutrality on the subject was genuine, which surprised her slightly. She found she didn't feel anything much about Margaret Holloway's departure except a faint, distant sympathy for the disruption of a life, even a life that had not been particularly kind to others. The mercantile incident had become, over time, exactly what it was, A small, sharp moment that had served primarily as the occasion for something much larger. The word plain had lost its power somewhere in the year of fence posts, and Sunday dinners and letters from Denver, and the weight of George Barnett's arms around her in her yard on a September afternoon. It had become, if anything, something she was almost grateful for, because without it the intervention that changed her life would not have had occasion to happen. Sheriff Cole retired in the summer of 1882 and was replaced by his deputy, a capable young man named Marcus Webb, no relation to Clarence Webb at the bank and considerably more competent. Cole came by the ranch to say his goodbyes on his way out of the territory, heading to his daughter's place in California, and he sat on their porch and drank coffee and looked at the two properties running together in the late summer green and said, "You've built something real here." "We have," George agreed. Cole looked at him for a moment. "You know, when I heard you were buying the Callaway place, I thought, here's a man who's going to be trouble, man with a bounty on him and a complicated history and a made-up name." He shook his head. "I was wrong about most of that. Not the complicated history part," George said. "No, that part I had right, but complicated history isn't the same as a man who's going to be trouble. Sometimes it's a man who's learned things from it." Cole looked at Abigail. "You're part of why that worked out, you know." "I'm not sure that's accurate," she said. "I am," Cole said simply. "A woman who knows her own mind is a steadying thing for a man who's been unsteady a while." After he left, George and Abigail sat on the porch in the long summer evening, and Thomas was playing in the yard with a corncob horse that Jonas Weber had made him, and Clara was in the house taking her afternoon sleep, and the cattle were moving through the pasture in the low golden light, and the mountains to the west were holding the last of the sun. "He was right, you know," George said, "about you being a steadying thing." "He made it sound like I was a useful piece of equipment," she said. He was not eloquent about it, but he wasn't wrong. George looked at her. "You're the steadiest person I've ever known. You were steady before you had anything to be steady about except stubbornness and determination. You were steady when it was hard and when it was frightening and when you had every reason to walk away from things." "Including you," she said. "Including me," he agreed. "You could have walked away from me in August when those men came to your farm, and you had every practical reason to decide I was more trouble than I was worth." "You were not more trouble than you were worth," she said. "No, no." She looked at him with the full, unambiguous directness that had once been described as too much for a woman's face, and that was, in fact, one of the best things about her. "You were worth exactly the trouble, and more." He took her hand. They sat watching Thomas in the yard and listening to the creek and the cattle and the evening coming on, and the light went amber and then rose and then blue, and the stars began. The following spring Abigail discovered she was expecting a third time, and the farm had grown to the point where they were considering a second barn and had just hired a third hand. A reliable older man named Clarence Beaumont, who had worked cattle ranches from Texas to Montana, and had seen enough of the world to appreciate a settled, well-run operation when he found one. Pete Ortega had, by this point, become so integral to the daily workings of their enterprise that George had sat down with him and had an honest conversation about the possibility of a share arrangement, a percentage of the operation's earnings in exchange for Pete's continued commitment, which Pete had received with a gravity that said he understood what was being offered and was not taking it lightly. Thomas was old enough by then to follow his father around the property on a small pony George had bought for him in town, a brown and white painted mare of impeccable patience that Thomas had named Duchess, with a solemnity that suggested he considered this a serious responsibility. George taught him to sit a horse with the same quiet, methodical care that he applied to everything, and Abigail watched them from the kitchen window, sometimes on the mornings when she was inside and they were out. This man and this boy who had his eyes and her stubbornness, and she felt a fullness in her chest that she had no adequate word for. Clara was walking by then, with the determined, wide-legged confidence of a child who has recently mastered upright locomotion and intends to make full use of it. She was dark-haired like both her parents, and had George's watchful quality, that stillness, observing everything around her with a thoroughness that Dr. Briggs had called, on one of his visits, the earliest sign of genuine intelligence. She and Thomas had already developed the particular alliance of siblings close in age, conducting what appeared to be lengthy private negotiations in a language that was approximately two-thirds real words, and which generally resulted in Thomas giving Clara whatever she wanted, which George said was good training for him in the art of practical diplomacy. Harriet Doyle's fifth child, born a few months after Thomas, was a boy named Robert, and he and Thomas had by this point become the particular kind of inseparable that farm children who live near each other become, and the Doyle and Barnett properties had developed their own informal connection as a result. With Harriet and Abigail meeting for coffee at least once a week, and their husbands handling the more immediate male friendship requirement through the practical medium of helping each other when help was needed. It was a life. A real, full, complicated, rewarding life, built on ground that had been hard and cold and difficult, and that had given itself up to them incrementally, in the way that good land does, in response to work and attention and the refusal to abandon it. In the autumn of that third year, when the second baby was 2 months away and the harvest was in and the days had gone short and cold and blue, George came home from town one afternoon with a particular expression on his face, the one that meant something unexpected had happened. She was at the stove and she looked at him over her shoulder and said, "What?" He set his hat on the hook by the door. "I ran into Clarence Webb at the bank." "Clarence Webb," she repeated. "The man who expected me to sell this place 2 years before you arrived. That one." George came and sat at the kitchen table, which was where all significant conversations in their household eventually landed. "He's changing his terms on 2 of the loans in this valley, calling them in early, Hargrove and the Peterson family." Abigail turned from the stove and looked at him. "He can't do that, not legally. Apparently he's found a way to argue that he can. They don't have the capital to settle immediately and he knows it. He's going to take their land." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Hargrove's west section backs onto the Peterson claim. Together they're 300 acres. Yes." George looked at her steadily. "I know what you're thinking. And I think you're right. If Webb gets that land, he'll sell to Dale Holloway's brother, who I heard in town is looking for a way back into this valley. And if Holloway comes back into this valley with that acreage, he's going to spend the next 10 years making our lives difficult. So we help Hargrove and the Petersons," she said. "It's not a small amount of capital." "I know." She sat down across from him. "We have it. Between what the harvest brought and what Pete's arrangement freed up in operating costs, we have it or close enough to it." He looked at her. "If something went wrong, something is going to go wrong either way. Either we risk some capital now and prevent a bad situation, or we don't risk it and live with the consequences." She met his eyes. "This is our community, George. These are our neighbors. This is what you stayed for." A long pause. She watched him think it through the way he thought everything through, carefully and honestly, turning it over and looking at it from all angles. Then he nodded. "All right. Just all right," she said. "I learned from the best," he said, and he smiled. They went together to the bank the following morning, and had a conversation with Clarence Webb that Abigail reflected later had probably been the most satisfying conversation of her adult life. Because Webb had been expecting, right up until about the 3rd minute of it, to be dealing with a farm woman and her rancher husband who were there to manage their own affairs, and he had not recalibrated quickly enough when the actual nature of the conversation became clear. By the end of it, he had agreed to a modified arrangement that kept Hargrove and the Petersons on their land, and he had done so with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it. George, walking out of the bank beside her into the cold autumn morning, said very quietly, "That was extraordinary." "He underestimated us," she said. "Everyone underestimates you," he said. "They keep doing it and you keep proving them wrong, and eventually I imagine some of them will learn." "Margaret Holloway never did," she said. "Well, she left. He held the door of the wagon for her, which he still did every time. Not everyone is capable of learning. No, she agreed. But some people are. That's enough. The third baby arrived in December, on a cold night when the snow was coming down outside the cabin windows, and the fire was built high in Dr. Briggs had made the 12-mile drive in a sleigh because the roads were too iced for a wagon. It was another boy, which Thomas received with visible satisfaction, and Clara received with a diplomacy that suggested she was reserving judgment until further information was available. They named him Daniel, for Harriet's husband, who was touched by this to a degree he found somewhat embarrassing and responded to it by making Thomas the best corncob horse in the history of the territory. The baby was healthy and Abigail was fine, and George sat by her in the quiet after the doctor had gone and the children were finally asleep and the snow was coming down soft outside, holding her hand and not saying anything for a long time. Then he said, "Daniel Thomas George Barnett." "Daniel," she said. "He looks like a Daniel." "He looks like a potato," George said, which made her laugh harder than she had any business laughing in her condition, and which she would later tell him was one of her very favorite things he had ever said. The years continued. The ranch grew. The children grew faster. Thomas, at 7, had his father's seriousness and his mother's stubbornness, and could already read at a level that impressed the schoolteacher who came to the valley 3 days a week, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Ellison, who had come west with the certainty that she could make a difference and had, in Abigail's assessment, been entirely right about that. Clara, 2 years behind, had opinions about everything and expressed them with a clarity that George said, with great love, was going to make her either very successful or very troublesome, and Abigail said it would probably be both. Daniel, the youngest, was the cheerful one, the one who laughed at everything, and was content to be passed between his mother and father and brother and sister and Pete and Jonas and old Clarence Beaumont, all of whom had some claim on him in the way that a family extends, in the right conditions, beyond blood. Pete Ortega married a woman named Rosa from the valley in the spring, and they made the Callaway house their own, painting the shutters and planting a kitchen garden on the south side, and their presence there seemed to Abigail to complete something, to make the whole enterprise of the 2 properties into what it had always been potentially, a community in the smaller, most essential sense of the word. In the summer when Thomas was 8, he asked his father one evening at the dinner table why they had 2 houses on the property. George looked at Abigail across the table with an expression she recognized, the one that meant he was going to handle this correctly. "'Cause families come in different shapes," George said. "The Ortegas are family to us, and that house is their home, and their home is part of what we all built here." Thomas thought about this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "Did you build it from nothing?" "Not quite nothing," George said. "We had a place that needed a lot of work. We did the work. Like you and Mama did with everything here. Like your mama and I did with everything here," George agreed. "Your mother more than me in the beginning. She built this place when it was hard and kept it when everyone thought she should let it go. I just came along later and helped." Thomas looked at his mother with a directness that was entirely hers. "Is that true?" "More or less," she said. "Your father is being modest about his contribution." "Modesty doesn't seem accurate," George said. "Proportion seems accurate." "You're arguing," Thomas observed. "We're not arguing," Abigail said. "We're discussing." "You always say that." "Because it's always true," George said. Thomas looked between them with the evaluative quality that had been part of him since before he could walk. "I think," he said, "that you built it together, even if Mama started first." Abigail looked at her son, this boy with her eyes and his father's way of cutting to the honest center of things, and she felt that fullness again, the one she had no adequate word for. "That," she said, "is exactly right." George caught her eye across the table, and in his face she saw everything they had been and done and built and survived and chosen. All of it. The mercantile and the fence line and the dancing and the letters and the trial and the ring and the vows and the children and the years and the mornings and the evenings, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days. She saw it all in his expression, and he saw it in hers, and they held that look for a moment the way people do when they know they are in the center of something they will always remember. Then Daniel threw his cornbread at Clara, and Clara retaliated with considerable precision, and George got up to manage the situation while Abigail covered her mouth to hide the laugh, and the evening went on the way evenings do, noisy and warm, and full of the particular richness of people who have found, against all the odds the world initially offered, exactly where they are supposed to be. Later, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the September stars were beginning over the valley in the vast dark sky of the high country, they sat on the porch the way they had been sitting on that porch since the summer they met, and the silence between them was the most comfortable thing in the world. "Do you ever think about that day in the mercantile?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "What made you speak up? You didn't know me. You'd never seen me before." He was quiet for a moment. "I heard what she said and I looked at you and I could see that what she said was wrong," he said. "Not just unkind, factually wrong. And I have never been able to keep quiet about something that's factually wrong. You didn't know it was factually wrong, you just seen me for about 30 seconds. I knew enough," he said. "There are people who walk into a room and you can see who they are in 30 seconds. Not everything, but enough." He looked at her. "I saw someone who was real, someone who was facing something hard and not breaking under it. That's not plain, that's the opposite of plain." "You said it was honest," she remembered. "Not kind, honest." "It was honest," he said. "I meant every word of it, I still do." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You know what the strangest thing is? Tell me." That word, the one she used, I was so used to hearing it from so many different people in so many different ways, and then you said what you said and something changed. Not because you said I was beautiful, not because you told me I was wrong to believe it, just because someone looked at me and saw something different and said so out loud." She paused. "It changed what was possible." He put his arm around her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes all it takes is one person seeing something clearly and saying it. That's all. You didn't save me. You didn't rescue me. You just disagreed with something false, out loud, in a room full of people. And that made a space where everything else could happen." "Everything else," he said. "All of this," she said. "This porch, this house. Those children in there, our land, Pete and Rosa, Harriet and Daniel and all of it." She looked up at him. "It all came from that one moment." He looked down at her with those river water eyes, and they had been looking at each other for years now, and she had never tired of it, and she was reasonably certain she never would, because there was always more in his face to find, always something she hadn't noticed or hadn't fully understood, the layers of a person who has lived a full and complicated life and is still living it forward. "It came from you," he said. "From who you were already. I just gave it a place to go." Abigail Ralston Barnett sat with her husband on their porch under the September stars, with their children sleeping in the house behind them and their land stretching out before them in the quiet dark, and she thought about a woman who had stood in a mercantile with her face burning and her spine straight and refused to fall apart. She thought about the girl she had been before her father died, the girl who had believed in the land the way her father had believed in it, with a faith that was stubborn rather than simple, earned rather than given. She thought about all the seasons of work and the slow, real growth of something she had built with her own hands and her own refusal to quit. She thought about a stranger in a doorway who had looked at her and said, quietly and without hesitation, "I would have to disagree." And she thought that of all the things the world had given her and taken from her and offered back again in different forms, that moment had been the one that everything else grew from, the small, solid root of what turned out to be an extraordinary life. "George," she said, "I love you." "I know," he said. "I love you too." And his arm tightened around her, warm and sure and real, and they stayed there together until the stars had moved across the sky and the night had deepened, and the valley had gone fully to sleep around them, and neither of them had any reason at all to move. The years ahead would bring more of what the years already had: work and weather, and the ordinary miracles of children growing into people, of land responding to care, of a community knitting itself together out of the individual threads of its members' lives. There would be more conversations at that kitchen table, and more evenings on that porch, and more mornings, where the light came over the ridge in a way that made even the most practical person stop for a moment and just look. There would be more of Thomas's serious assessments, and Clara's opinions, and Daniel's laughter, and Pete's steady presence, and Rose's kitchen garden, and Harriet's bread and news, and the particular sustaining constancy of good neighbors and genuine friendship. There would be more. There would always be more, because they had built something that grew, and they had built it on the only foundation that holds in any weather, which is two people who look at each other truly and choose, every day, what they see. Abigail Ralston had been told she was too plain for that town, and the town had believed it more or less, the way towns believe the things that are said loudly and confidently enough for long enough. And then a man had disagreed, out loud, in front of everyone. Not because it was kind, but because it was true. And the world had turned on that small hinge and opened into something neither of them had been able to imagine from where they were standing that June afternoon in 1878. It had opened into this, into all of it, into everything that mattered and everything that lasted and everything that was, in the end, completely and entirely enough. More than enough. Everything.